Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Lawlor. I work for Governor Dan Malloy in Connecticut. I'm his criminal justice guy, but I also have the honor of chairing the executive board of the Council State Government's Justice Center. As an introduction to this panel, I want to tell you a very brief story. Before I had this job, I was a legislator for 24 years in Connecticut, and I was there in the late 80s and early 90s when a lot of the criminal justice policies we talk about today were implemented. In the mid-90s, it became very clear, if you had a meeting of legislators from different states, prosecutors, public defenders, victims, et cetera, that people agreed on a vast majority of the things that needed to be done to make the criminal justice system work better. And that was kind of the genesis of what has grown into the Justice Center. We have a commitment to bipartisan, multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional cooperation to develop best practices and help implement those in every state and every county in the country. And I think your participation here today is the best illustration of the extraordinary success of this cooperative, bipartisan model. 20 years ago, I don't think anyone could have imagined that the discussions that take place today at the highest levels here in Washington would even be possible. And today's panel is an extraordinary illustration of that. So with that, let me introduce Mike Thompson, the Executive Director of the Council State Government's Justice Center.
Thanks, Mike. Hi again. Nice to see you all again, and I am very excited about this next panel, which I think is going to be a real fascinating discussion and a wonderful microcosm of the left-right conversation that we've been talking about now and the momentum, bipartisan momentum building across the country. At the last session, we asked you, we polled you, and we said, do you have a left-right coalition in your state? Is it, what's the status of it? Does one exist at all? Is it quite strong, or is it sort of still in the emerging state? And I think the majority of you answered that there's some coalition. A third of you said that there was a strong coalition. About 1 out of 5 said no coalition yet in place. Well, I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation for those of you who are wondering about how to build that coalition, make it stronger, or at least get it off the ground. And the people that I'm going to introduce, I think if you're an elected official or you're a political pundit, you'll certainly agree that these two gentlemen, one represents the left, the other represents the right. From the right, Mark Holden, who is the Senior Vice President and the General Counsel and Secretary to Koch Industries. Mark is the President and COO of the Legal Division of Koch Companies. He's the Chairman of the Board of the Freedom Partners Chamber of Commerce. He's been with Koch Industries now for many years. He has many, many responsibilities, and I think it's a huge illustration of his commitment to this issue of criminal justice that he's come all the way to be with us today, and we are thrilled to have him here. To his right, although not politically necessarily, is Van Jones, who is, you may know, as a CNN commentator. He's the best-selling author of Rebuild the Dream. He was one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world. Van is equally hard-charging, and you know he's a celebrity because this man just stepped off an airplane from a red-eye. He was actually commenting on the debates last night on the West Coast, and here we have him on the East Coast. And I think, again, it's an incredible illustration of his commitment to this particular issue to find time to be with us today. So please join me first in thanking our two left and right panelists, Mark Holden and Van Jones. The other person with us on stage today is Denise ODonnell. She is the director of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and you've heard BJA's name a lot. That's because BJA is the agency that's overseeing all the grants that have been awarded in this room. Needless to say, she is a very important person in your life. And we are incredibly grateful for all that she is doing on behalf of the Department of Justice. And as somebody who represents state government officials everywhere, we see Director ODonnell as one of ours. She was the head of the entire public safety system in the state of New York. She has a history in law enforcement as a prosecutor, but she will also tell you as her background as a social worker. She is also going to be offering commentary during the course of this panel. Please join me in welcoming Denise ODonnell. So I'm a policy wonk. We sit and we sort of look over numbers and try and staff elected officials, but Van, I do secretly dream of one day getting to moderate a crossfire session, and this is, I think, the closest I'm ever going to get. So I'm going to now tell you in advance that I'm going to be asking questions. We're not going to be doing speeches, and this will be an interactive discussion. And Director O'Donnell, I'll be bringing you in from time to time. We understand the precarious position of the Department of Justice, so we're not going to ask you to be taking some of these tricky positions that Van and Mark take quite easily. Let me start with our first question to Van Jones, and that is we just keep talking about a bipartisan interest in criminal justice reform. We just keep saying criminal justice reform, bipartisan interest. Can you help us visualize from your perspective, what does that actually look like several years from now? What will it look like when the system has been reformed?
Well, first of all, it's just an honor to be here, and it's good to be here with Mark. The first time I think we were on TV together, but I think we broke Twitter. It was kind of a crazy thing, but it's been just a remarkable opportunity to work with somebody who is as dedicated and as committed to this fight as Mark is, as you will quickly hear. I also just want to just give a little bit of context and color and flavor before I get into all the nerdy stuff. A miracle happened in August, and it was so miraculous it was almost not commented on, but I always want to start off talking about this. This was the craziest thing I ever saw. This president, President Obama, went to a prison. First time any president's ever gone to sitting president's gone to any federal prison ever in the history of the Republic. That's not the miracle. That's maybe a quarter of the miracle. But the fact that this issue has hit the mainstream so much that the president can go and wants to go to a prison, major. Then he comes out of the prison. He doesn't come out of the prison saying what you might have expected a president to say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Hey, look, kids, you do the crime, you do the time, pull your pants up, you're going to wind up in here. This is what happens to people who do stuff wrong. He comes out and says, you know what? But for the grace of God, I could have been one of these people. Just with a little bit less support, I would have been in here. The President of the United States says this system's gotten so big, it's pulling in so many people, he could have been in here. That's still only about half the miracle. Then, not one serious Republican or conservative leader in the country attacks him at all.
That's a miracle.
Now you're getting to the miraculous part, you see? Not one. This is a president who, if he put out a bill that said kittens are cute, would have.
I'm a dog guy.
Do you understand? But that's still only 3/4 of the miracle. Then the same day, then Speaker Boehner is giving a press comment about something totally unrelated. Somebody asked him a question, Boehner, trying to tee up the attack against the president. And Boehner not only does not go for it, Boehner says he wants a floor vote on bipartisan reform this year. Goes over his committee chair's head to say, I want a floor vote. Personally, I want a floor vote. Now that's a miracle. That's a miracle. In a town where everybody fights over everything, nobody agrees on anything, somehow this issue has emerged as the common ground, common sense set of possibilities. Now, that didn't come out of nowhere, and we'll talk about how we got there, but I think it's important to recognize when good things happen, and I think it's important to build on that. So that said, for me, to keep this relatively high level, I think the prison system should be half the size and twice as effective. We've got about 2.2 million people behind bars. I think 1 million's plenty. We'd still be the biggest incarcerator in the world. And I think it should be twice as effective. In other words, twice as effective in terms of the number of people who go through the system and who come out better, not worse. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and I'll let others talk about it. There's a whole bunch of stuff to get you there. But if you can think about over a 10-year period, doing what we did with juvenile justice, nobody remembers this. Over the past 10 years, we've cut the juvenile prison population in half with no increase in youth violence and no increase in youth crime. So I mean, that's a huge success. So if we can just do for the adult system what we did for the kid system, I think we'll be in good shape.
Thank you, Van. Mark, so Van's proposed that a reform system looks half as big in terms of the prison population and twice as effective. Agree?
That'd be great. I don't know what it will look like 10 years from now. I'll just tell you why we're involved and why it's so important to us, because, and you know, you said I'm on the right. I don't know if we are or not. Charles Koch is a classical liberal, and the reality is why we're involved. There's a moral case, there's a constitutional case, and there's a fiscal case. And right now, let's just focus on the morality, because that gets everybody in the door, left, right, center, whatever. And the reality is, if you're wealthy and connected, you're going to be fine in our system. It may not be pretty, it may take a while, but you'll be okay. And if you're poor, you're not going to be. You're going to get it coming and going from the beginning to the middle to the end. And that's wrong. It's not right. It's the largest barrier to opportunity for the least advantaged. You know, growing up in Worcester, Mass, I could very much empathize with what President Obama said at El Reno prison. I worked in a prison in Massachusetts, and there are a bunch of kids I went to school with who were inmates, were junior high and high school classmates. And the only thing that I could tell the difference, we went to the same schools, same neighborhoods, same churches, everything else. The only difference I saw was I had parents who held me accountable, who made me go to school and made me work. And these were poor white kids. In our system, if you're poor, you make a mistake and you don't have any family support, anyone to help you, you're going to get run over. And that's from the charging decisions all the way down the line, indigent defense programs, sentencing, corrections, reentry. You know, it's over-criminalize, over-charge, over-prosecute, over-sentence, over-incarcerate, and then overburden on the way out. So for us, the system needs to be where we worked from beginning to end. We got to look at the laws that we have in place. What are we criminalizing and why? And does it make sense to do that? Then we need to look at how we charge people all the way down the line. And so for us, our system, if we can get back to what we're supposed to be doing here in a free society, it's should be a very, very high bar, a very high standard before someone loses life, liberty, property in the pursuit of happiness. That is not the case anymore. And it should be individual justice for individuals based on their circumstances. And right now that's not happening, and it's created this cycle of despair, poverty, and incarceration. And so what would I think would happen, I don't know, 10 years from now, if it works right, if we start to look at who we're putting in prison and realize that maybe some of them just need a job, some of them need drug treatment, mental health treatment, some of them needed a positive role model, some of them need an education, keeping people out of the pipeline, those in prison, having them do something besides become a better criminal, having them get education, treatment, vocational training, whatever it is. And then on the way out, people, instead of our system that's seen as, you know, it's revenge, retribution, it should be rehabilitation, reform, and redemption. And I think that if we can get that right, and we can address issues farther up the pipeline, and I'd hope it could be in a bipartisan way on education and opportunity, jobs, that type of thing. There's a study out there at Villanova University that says if mass incarceration hadn't happened over the past 20 or 30 years, poverty would be down like 20% or so. That's beautiful. Yeah. So criminal justice reform is a civil rights issue, it's an opportunity issue, it's an economic engine, and it's the right thing to do. So we're hopeful that's what happens.
So let me jump in here and say that you're talking to a room of 1,500 people, and I would say it's fair to venture that the vast majority would be saying right on with everything both of you have said. This is in many ways the choir. I think that these are people that have dedicated, in many cases, their lifetime, certainly are dedicating their time right now to accomplishing many of the goals that you've just described. Part of the challenge that I think a lot of folks run into is that when they're talking to business leaders or local officials or elected officials, and there is now more interest in engaging, and they say, you know what, I am ready to help first-time, nonviolent people. There is something that we can really do for them. And what so many people in this room know is that many of whom we're talking about aren't first-time offenders. Many of whom we're talking about do have violent, they've either been convicted right now for a violent offense or they have violent histories. What do you think is the real political appetite for doing something different with that kind of population? Van, you want to start?
Low. But I'll go on. So, yeah, for more serious and more violent offenders, there's less appetite. And that's just the truth of where we are. Movements don't start where they end. Rosa Parks sat on a bus. When Dr. King got brought in by the women who did all the organizing and actually were the geniuses behind it, when Dr. King and others got brought into that, their demand was that they have a kinder, gentler segregation on the bus. Do the history. It was let the African Americans fill the bus in from the back, let the whites fill in from the front, and wherever you stop, but don't have African American mothers standing over empty seats. That was the initial demand. Within 10 years, the entire country was transformed, because movements have a logic that unfolds. The first thing we have to do is to get people to act on what they know. The problem we have right now is that people know. Look, I went to Yale for law school. 80% of the students on that campus, nonviolent drug offenders. And half the faculty. So the first thing we got to do is just get people to act on what they know, and then people can move forward from there. But I have been profoundly moved and educated by a guy named Shaka Senghor. Shaka is a good friend of ours. He did 19 years in prison for a violent crime that he did commit. African American guy, Detroit gang member, drug seller. He got shot. A few weeks later, he shot someone else. That other person actually died. He went to prison for a violent crime he did commit. Second-degree murder. 19 years. 7 years in solitary confinement. 7 years. 30 days you have to get mental health. 7 years. He got a letter from his son that said, Daddy, I'm old enough now to know what you did. You're a murderer. You're a killer. That's wrong. And Shaka was so shattered, not by his experience, but by his son's letter, to realize his son would only see him as the worst thing he ever did. And he decided, one in a gazillion, he's going to change his life. He fought for books. He organized his life in solitary confinement so that every hour was like he had a different class. Shaka Senghor is now a fellow at MIT. Shaka Senghor's TED Talk was one of the top 5 last year. Shaka Senghor's memoir, which nobody would publish because he's a convicted murderer, somehow by a miracle wound up in Oprah Winfrey's hands. She interviewed him. She said it was one of the top 5 conversations, not interviews, one of the top 5 conversations she's ever had with anybody. She's had a few conversations. She bought the film rights to his book. Now his book's coming out. This guy is going to be, I think, one of the most positive, powerful influences in the world. And yet he's a violent, convicted offender. So at some point, we're going to realize you can't throw anybody away. Everybody counts, everybody matters, everybody has a future more important than their past. But let's at least start where there's agreement that we shouldn't be throwing people in prison for what we know is going on every day on Ivy League campuses, country clubs, yacht clubs, and every place else in America.
Thanks. Mark?
Yeah, I think, having met Shaka, it changed my view of things for sure. I think what take a step back here. It's something Brian Stevens calls proximity. So you need to be proximate to something. And I was proximate from a young age, working in a prison, seeing the type of offenders that were in there. Over the past couple of years, there were violent offenders in the prison I worked in, but I didn't know them from high school. Well, one of the guys was a murderer, but he wasn't my friend, so I didn't hang with him. But in all seriousness, you know, there is this whole thing, they're violent offenders, non-violent. What I've learned the last year from men like Shaka Senghor, also Jesse Weiss, who works with Justice Fellowship, and then there's a gentleman from Washington, D.C. named Lamont Carey. They're all violent offenders. And, you know, I've learned, and working with Cory Booker as well, Senator Booker, who's just been phenomenal, in my opinion, true inspiration, real leader on these issues. Everyone who's a violent offender has been the victim of some type of abuse, be it violence, physical, mental, what have you. So it gets back to what Van said, and again, I'm going to crib from Brian Stevenson. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. But it'll take time to overcome that, because people aren't proximate and people are very judgy in this country. You know, we're talking about second chances, and you all are heroes working on the second chances. And it's so important, because we're waiting for Congress to do something. And, you know, we need an act of Congress, but I like to say the things you work on every day and have worked on forever, we don't really need an act of Congress, it's an act of conscience. We need communities to open their hearts and minds. And I think when people do that, when they get to meet people, they get to see the person, and they understand the circumstances, like Shaka's situation, it kind of makes sense what happened. And it's awful what happened, and he's paid his price. But now let's move on. Let's let people try to have a successful life, because the reality is, no one likes violent offenders, let's be clear. But the reality is, I've heard all kinds of stats, 90%, 95%, 97% of the people are coming out. So we got a choice to make, and it's in all our interests to come out better people, and they don't reoffend, they don't hurt themselves, their families, their communities, and others. And regardless of, you know, whatever you might think about someone and what they did on their worst day, realize they are coming out, and let's make sure they all have better days ahead. So I don't know what's going to happen, obviously, at the federal level with the legislation. I do know, if you look at what's a federal violent crime, and you'll be able to explain this better than me, it's not always linear. It's not clear what is. Things that you might think are violent aren't. The state level, that's the case. I know it's some state reforms, like, for example, in Mississippi, they've gone through their criminal code. What's violent, what isn't? This isn't really violent. Let's try to rework that. So I think it's going to be a combination of things. But the reality is, to get to that next step, we have to have the first step. And the first step are the bills, and we're going to talk about it, I'm sure, that are pending in the House and the Senate. That needs to happen. And those, once we have success there, we'll keep going. We're going to keep moving the chains and keep going. So that would be the next bite, I think, and it's going to be a heavier lift, but I think it's all attainable once you start to meet people like Shaka and Jesse and Lamont and others, and hear their stories and talk about, and you see what grace, dignity they have, and how they've atoned for what they've done, and they live their lives in a way to make up for it. And I think we should all try to get behind that. That's just my personal view.
Thanks, Mark. So let's go to the federal system and bring in Director O'Donnell. So Director O'Donnell, your charge is implementing the legislation passed by Congress. And so can you talk a little bit about what it's been like from your position with this growing federal bipartisan support from Congress, and what that's meant for BJA?
Well, it's been fabulous. We have had bipartisan support all along with the Second Chance Act. You know, it passed and was signed into law by President Bush. Yep, need this a little closer. Okay. Mentioned that the Second Chance Act originated in the Republican administration and signed into law by President Bush. But to have this kind of bipartisan support that we're hearing here, and the leadership to come together to support our initiatives is fabulous. So I was spending my time right before coming here looking at the budget numbers, which came out this morning, and am so delighted to see that in these tough times, our funding for Second Chance has remained significant and still at a little uptick to $68 million to support Second Chance Act programs. That's great news. Our justice reinvestment. Well, yeah. With this kind of bipartisan support for justice reinvestment, just a few years ago, that was funded at $6 million a year. We're now up to $18 million to support JRI, which is so important. And we have an uptick in funding for our justice and mental health collaboration work to about $10 million this year. So it translates into dollars and into financial support on the Hill, but it is an incredible influence in changing opinions and changing attitudes. When I think back when we did Rockefeller drug reform in New York, we had to put it in the governor's budget to get that passed. And to talk about violent offenders was just off the table at that time. And now we're seeing, the kind of discussion, enlightened discussion that we have here today. So to have this kind of support is just incredible for those of us on the ground trying to do this work.
Thanks, Denise. And again, I think it's a huge achievement, right? We know that so many programs under so much scrutiny, and here you have Congress coming together saying that thanks to the work that you were doing, this is a program that we want to continue funding at this level. It's really a testament to the efforts of so many of you in this room, and very exciting news coming from Congress late last night, so thank you. Let's continue on this theme of the federal system. So many of us are talking about exciting things happening in the states and wondering when the federal government, Congress, is going to follow suit. Van, you talked about the Speaker talking about a floor vote. What do both of you see as the remaining obstacles to getting federal legislation passed?
Well, first of all, the fact that we're having this conversation at all at the federal level is incredible. I was on the air January when we swore in the new Congress, and people were asking, well, what can this Congress and this president do together? And people were, well, maybe tax reform. I was like, right. Just people just spitballing, just throwing crazy stuff out there. And I said, I think it's going to be criminal justice reform. Now, this is less than a year ago. To give you a sense of how nutty that sounded just in January, there's something that your producer will say to you if you're kind of off topic in your ear. It's rap, right? They don't mean hip hop. They mean wrap it up. Right? Move on. And so I was trying to explain why I thought criminal justice reform was going to be rap. Like, dude, you're like, so. And my co-panelists looking at me like I was literally talking about some, alien species. So in January of this year, this was off the table. So I just want people to understand how much work has been done to get us to this point. We now do have two bills. One is out of committee on the Senate side. The Safe Justice Act has been sort of broken up a little bit, but we have basically two pieces in the House. I think that the things that are in the way right now, first of all, this town doesn't do multiple things at a time very well. And so I think fundamentally you have this overhang right now, the concern about ISIS and other issues. Specific to the legislation, there's a couple of sticking points. Whenever you put a coalition like this together, there are lots of different interests in trying to figure out who gets how much of what is always tough. So there's some issues, this mens rea issue, whether or not a criminal intent has to be present for all crimes, including white-collar corporate crimes, maybe even environmental crimes. That's a tough issue for Democrats because Democrats may be more concerned about the people we've been talking about up until now, aren't as aware and aren't as dialed into some of the other concerns, and also, even when informed, just don't agree. So that's an issue we've got to figure out a way around. I think another thing is just, there's just not that many legislative days, actual legislative days left because you have the presidential election. And once you get to February, March, April, it's very hard to get anything serious done. So I think we've got a time crunch. I think we have a couple issues that are some sticking point issues, and we have some other issues that are important in the country. So we put all that together, we're hitting some headwinds right now.
Yeah, Mark?
Little perspective. I was here last March. It's where I first met Roy Austin at Van and Newt Gingrich's Cut 50 Summit. And I was on a panel, and they're always calling us odd fellows and unlikely bedfellows and all this other stuff. But I was on.
Dynamic duo.
Yeah, there you go. Shake and bake. Talladega Nights reference. Anyway, the questions that I got, one of the questions was, is anything going to happen here? Are we going to get any reform? Right. You know, Grassley's going to resist any types of substantive, meaningful sentencing reform. And my answer was, he's going to do the right thing. I know he will, and I think it will happen. And I believe that, and it has happened. And so you take a step back 8 months later, what Van's bringing up about the mens rea standard, the intent standard, I mean, in all seriousness, if you told us 8 months ago we'd be fighting, that'd be an issue. We'd been, all right, we'll take this. This is good. And it shouldn't be a sticking point, the mens rea issue. We've made our position known. But really, we're talking at some level about painting the lips on the Mona Lisa, right? I mean, this is going to be the first time, and there's been a lot of good stuff out there between. Second Chance Act is a great act. We've got the Franken-Cornyn bill on mental health that just came out is great. There's a lot of individual pieces, but comprehensive criminal justice reform has not happened since the 1980s or earlier, going to the 70s, right? And you're talking bipartisan, which it needs to be because Reagan and Bush and Clinton have all done this. So I stay focused on that, and there's a lot of great stuff in both bills. And to the extent Congress puts mens rea in, we think it makes sense that only people who intend to commit crimes go to prison, lose their life, liberty, and property. But if it's not in there, that's okay too. There's so much good stuff. And I think that it's always amazing to me, in a town like DC, I'm hearing people say, well, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm thinking, you're talking about Congress. I mean, seriously, take it pass fail, guys, because you ain't perfect. That's not good. And so I'm hopeful, especially now with Speaker Ryan in the House. He's made some comments about how committed he is to these issues, and I know that they are in the Senate as well. We'll find the right balance, and people of good conscience and good faith on both sides of the aisle are going to work it out. And I think it's going to happen, and I think there'll be a floor vote, is my prediction, by late January, early February is the hope and the goal, and hopefully it's something that everybody's happy with, and we'll have it signed by the President, and that'll be a great start.
Yeah. Let me just say one thing. I know we're running short on time. You know, the nature of this particular coalition is highly unusual in that usually when you have a bipartisan coalition, you have kind of, you know, the mushy middle of both parties coming together to do very little. And there's often a lot of money on the table at the same time. So you have big financial interests writing big checks to mushy middle people to accomplish very little. That's the basic formula for bipartisanship, which is why everybody, when they hear the word bipartisan, they just go, yeah, often. It just doesn't seem like anything good comes out of that. This is a very different thing. You actually have not mushy middle people. You have very strong liberals and very strong libertarians leading the charge. So you have people who are coming at this from a conviction point of view, from a passion point of view, from a principle point of view. Nobody's writing big checks. People say, well, how come the Koch brothers aren't writing big checks? No, that would be the worst thing. Nobody's writing big checks on either side. People are sitting down because they actually believe in something, and people are actually trying to get a lot done. So this is a very unusual thing. It's a conviction-based, principle-based thing. And you say, well, how can that be? Liberals have completely different principles than libertarians. That is true. However, we are a liberty and justice for all country. The right, if you want to use that term, is very strong at its best on questions of liberty. Individual rights, limited government. The incarceration industry is running over conservative values in that regard, not to mention conservative Christian values and other values. But just the basic idea of limited government and individual liberty, the incarceration industry is running over conservative values. And obviously, liberty and justice, liberals at our best are very good on questions of justice. No little group should get run over just because it's poor, because it looks different, because it prays different. And the incarceration industry is really running over poor folks and people of color. So from a liberty and justice for all perspective, it's not a left-right alliance, it's a liberty and justice for all alliance, trying to fix something that's really offending the principles of both parties. And if you talk to people that way in your states, I think you can grow this thing. It doesn't have to all, listen, for me, it's a lot about race. It doesn't have to all be about race. For other people, it's a lot about individual liberty. It's liberty and justice for all, and with that, I think we can win a lot more.
So let me go, we're going to go into our speed round now, the sort of the last 6 minutes or so that we have, and I want to bring it back to the state and local level. Mark, so many of the folks here, you referenced earlier the vast majority of people in prison coming out, coming back to the community. And as folks here in this room know, you're talking about people who need substance abuse treatment. They need mental health services. They need job training and education. They need housing. And the investments just aren't there for those kinds of services. So what's your sense about the appetite among conservative elected officials to make those kinds of investments for this population?
Well, I don't know what the appetite would be. I'd hope that with $250 billion rattling around in our criminal justice system spent annually, and the $80 billion on incarceration, which is 3 to 4 times more per capita than we spend on education, I would hope there's some money for that. I think we need to fund that. I think that a lot of Republicans, red states in particular, have led the way on reforms, and they get brought in for the fiscal case, like everybody does, to your point. You got to look at what you're spending your money on. And then the fiscal case is the moral case, because every dollar we're spending incarcerating someone who doesn't need to be incarcerated, we're not spending on schools, we're not spending on substance abuse treatment, roads, mental health treatment. So I think there is appetite for that. I think it's redirecting resources, and it has to happen. And I think it's important that that happen. I think that conservatives will lead the way on it. That's my sense. I do think that there are a lot of things, again, you can do in your community, which you all know this, so you don't need me to say it. I do think there are things private employers can do, and I'm glad to see the federal government, President Obama is leading the way on this, banning the box. It's very important, because when you look at all the different programs that I'm familiar with, whether it's youth mentoring or reentry or whatever it is, what they try to do is have a situation where someone feels supported and accountable, and they also want to have a situation where if they need education, but the bottom line is people need jobs. And in Wichita, Kansas, where I'm from, my wife and I work with a group called Rise Up for Youth. It's run by David and Lynn Gilkey. And David Gilkey is an ex-offender who has turned his life around in a profound way, as has Lynn. They're amazing people. David's slogan has T-shirts made up that says, "Nothing stops a bullet like a job." And so that's what has to happen. And my bet is that this, we can get this right. We can start reducing the size of the inmate population, get people out, the funding will come. That's my hope.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to turn back to BJA, Director O'Donnell. As we see those increased investments made, elected officials want to see results. And so what do you think, the movement, how are we going to see providers increasingly held accountable for actual reductions in recidivism?
Well, I think it starts at the top. We have success-oriented programs now for recidivism reduction for the states, but also under the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. We heard Secretary Wetzel give great opening remarks, but one of the profound things he did under JRI in Pennsylvania was to start success-oriented funding for his halfway houses or step-down facilities from his prison. As I understand it, they were investing about $100 million into step-down facilities. They went into a success-oriented funding protocol where they would pay 1% additional funding for those facilities that reduced recidivism, and the threat that funding would be cut off for other programs that did not meet recidivism goals and targets. And as a result, in 1 year of data, they have actually, these facilities have reduced recidivism by 11%. And that's a kind of programs that we really want to see invested in. Mike, I just want to make one other comment on the federal reform side, because I'd like everybody to be waiting for the report of the Charles Colson Task Force 2 that Congress funded to really look at what's been going on in the states in the Justice Reinvestment Initiative with a federal lens. And I think it's going to be really important to this discussion in January to hear from the Bipartisan Commission that Congress created on justice reform as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks, Director. So we have just about 2 minutes left, so if I can just 1 minute from both Mark and from Van. We heard at the outset that people don't necessarily have a strong coalition in place in their communities. And I think on the left, we hear elected officials who still are scarred from the memories of going back to Willie Horton and those kinds of political fights. And from the right, business leaders, who people are concerned, they're just saying they have other priorities. They have other special populations, if you will, veterans and others that they really want to make a priority. So could you give a little bit of advice to folks in this room when they go home about how they can really engage constituents that you see as core to this left-right coalition?
Let me start. Well, I think that I can only speak to what I see in Wichita, Kansas, because that's where I live. I think that you need to meet people where they are, and I just know the groups we work with. I don't know that they're dividing them up between, well, wait, you're a veteran, or wait, you're a drug addict, sorry, you're mentally ill. I don't know what to say other than open your hearts and minds and realize that these people need a chance. They need an opportunity. We're calling it second chances, things I've seen growing up, things that we hear about from different offenders and in different situations. A lot of people haven't even had a first chance, right? So we owe them at least a second first chance, or whatever you want to call it. I think that's what Mr. Wetzel was saying earlier. It's a first chance act. So I would hope that people don't really divide them up between veterans or this, that, or the other. They just see people that need to be helped, and they're going to help them. And I think most people who are working in the reentry space or the youth mentoring space look at it that way.
Thanks, Mark. Van?
Personal relationships actually matter. Newt Gingrich and I had a TV show together for about a year, and we managed to not agree on anything the entire year except this issue. And I learned, if you talk about it a certain way, you talk about a big, unaccountable government bureaucracy that's wasting a ton of money and gets rewarded for bad outcomes. If God bless them, but if a prison, if a warden sends out 10 guys on Monday or 10 women on Monday, they come back on Friday with all their friends, they don't get a budget cut. Nobody gets fired. So being able to talk about this is a question of how do we align financial incentives again? And I wouldn't just pick on the poor little program providers at the tail end of the tailpipe and say, you guys got to fix recidivism. I would want to say throughout the whole process, if you're a warden, let's evaluate you based on how well your folks do. And frankly, if you send 10 people out and they never come back, you should get a $500,000 bonus. I have no problem with that. I'm serious. Put some financial skin in the game. I want that warden to see every person in her facility as a potential financial benefit based on their success. If you get out there, you do a good job in social impact bonds, all this sort of stuff. But if you're here, you go out, you do a good job, guess what? I just saved the state a bunch of money. I'm going to be rewarded for that. We've got to completely rethink this thing because we're so far off track. But I think the other thing I want to say is simply this. It may not be so bad in your states, but it probably is. There is it's beyond partisan now. It has become a tribal political culture where if the other side gets anything, it's like it came out of your hide. And that has to go. In a democracy, we don't have to agree with each other on stuff. Mark and I don't agree with each other on everything. In a dictatorship, you have to agree on everything. Democracy, you don't have to. So where you don't agree, you're supposed to fight. But where you do agree, you're supposed to work together. That's what we teach our children. If your kid came home, I'm never going to play with that kid, she's got the cooties. You say, no, that's not how we do stuff. We got cooties politics up here in D.C. where people just will not play together because that kid's got the cooties. And people are suffering all across the country. So I think that it's just, honestly, the fact that Newt and I became friends. We decided, let's do something. I said, we were having these great conversations in private. Newt's a genius. He said, let's have it in public. He said, I'll close with this. He said, well, if we get 100 leaders together for 1 hour in D.C., we can make a huge difference. We reached out to Roy at the White House. He said, you know what? I think it's a good idea. We didn't get 100 leaders for an hour. We got 700 leaders for 7 hours, 10 congresspeople, 3 governors, 2 cabinet secretaries. The president sent a video, and that was with what, Roy, maybe 3-4 weeks notice? I mean, it was not a lot of money, but at a certain point, there were enough good relationships that we were able to get something done. So it can happen. It happened here. It can happen anywhere.
Thanks, Vin. Can we put up the poll? Can we put up the last poll? Can we put up the last poll that we had? The second question that we asked you before in the earlier session was 2 years from now, do you think that this bipartisan coalition that exists nationally is going to be weaker than it is today, about what it is today, or stronger? And 2/3 of you said it's going to be stronger. And
You're
I
right.
think
You're
a
right.
key reason it's going to be stronger is because of the fantastic example and leadership that these wonderful people at the head of the stage are setting for all of us, the kind of time they're setting aside for this. Thank you very, very much for all you're doing on this issue. Please join me in thanking this terrific panel.